My fellow citizens, at this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger. On my orders, coalition forces have begun striking selected targets of military importance to undermine Saddam Hussein's ability to wage war. These are opening stages of what will be a broad and concerted campaign. To all the men and women of the United States Armed Forces now in the Middle East, the peace of a troubled world and the hopes of an oppressed people now depend on you. That trust is well placed. The enemies you confront will come to know your skill and bravery. The people you liberate will witness the honorable and decent spirit of the American military. We come to Iraq with respect for its citizens. We have no ambition in Iraq except to remove a threat and restore control of that country to its own people. The people of the United States and our friends and allies will not live at the mercy of an outlaw regime that threatens the peace with weapons of mass murder. We will meet that threat now with our Army, Air Force, Navy, Coast Guard, and Marines, so that we do not have to meet it later with armies of firefighters and police and doctors on the streets of our cities. My fellow citizens, the dangers to our country and the world will be overcome. We will pass through this time of peril and carry on the work of peace. We will defend our freedom. We will bring freedom to others, and we will prevail. May God bless our country and all who defend her.
Wars aren't sold in a day. So how was this one sold? Because it didn't start here. Well, I'll tell you, but first, some background. This is Britney Spears. She's an American pop star who rose to prominence in the late 90s and early 2000s. In 2003, she was interviewed by CNN's Tucker Carlson. Yes, Tucker Carlson used to work for CNN. It's a long story. She'd gotten into controversy after sharing a kiss with Madonna at the VMAs. Also a long story. Anyway, so the interview was kind of ironic, where Tucker Carlson would ask such pressing questions as,
candidly, just between you and me, how much Pepsi do you think you drink on an average day?
I really do like Pepsi.
Really? What's your favorite kind?
I really do. My favorite kind of Pepsi? Pepsi's Pepsi.
Well, you don't drink Diet Pepsi or
no,
Pepsi
just regular Pepsi.
And
so what are your favorite shows on television?
My favorite shows on television? Sex and the City, definitely. Sex and the City, Friends, of course. And I like these reality shows on MTV now. I think it's very humorous to watch the new Jessica Simpson and Nick Lachey show, and the Wade Robson Project. I love that.
And
do you watch a lot of CNN?
Oh, CNN all the time. All the time.
I knew I liked you, Brittany.
You know?
But Carlson would also ask the pop star some more serious questions, probably for comedic effect, like this one.
You're going to be on the National Mall soon, performing for Pepsi and the NFL, and also to support our troops. A lot of entertainers have come out against the war in Iraq. Have you?
Honestly, I think we should just trust our president in every decision that he makes, and we should just support that, you know, and be faithful in what happens.
Do you trust this president?
Yes, I do.
Now, I'm not hating on Britney Spears at all. I love Britney Spears. Who doesn't? And to be fair, her opinion was a pretty common one. At the time, the 2003 invasion of Iraq was incredibly popular, with over 70% of Americans initially supporting it. The war dominated political debates of the early 2000s, but it seems that today's young people, Gen Z, who are either very young or hadn't even been born at the time of the invasion, have very little knowledge of the war and the politics and controversies surrounding it, besides a few memes of us going in for oil. This makes sense since the war is just too recent and controversial for most history classes to cover it in depth. But it's also a real shame, since it's a very important war and its aftermath still shapes a lot of our foreign policy today. So in this video series, I thought I'd explain to my fellow Gen Zers, and also just anyone else who's curious, the details and events that led to, occurred during, and happened after the Iraq War. The 2003 one. There are several. Iraq is a mid-sized Middle Eastern country that at the time had about 27 million people. Like most Middle Eastern countries, it was once part of the British Empire. The country gained independence in the 30s as a monarchy, but through a series of coups, the country developed into a dictatorship under the Ba'athist Party, a socialist party that wanted to unite all Arab countries into one secular socialist state. By the late 1970s, Iraq was under the control of Saddam Hussein, a brutal Ba'athist dictator. During his reign, he systemically imprisoned, tortured, executed, and repressed the Iraqi people. The goals of the war were threefold. 1. Topple Iraq's dictator. 2. Introduce democracy into Iraq. And 3, most urgently, and most infamously, disarm Iraq of its alleged weapons of mass destruction. You see, ever since the 1960s, Iraq has had a program that developed, quote, weapons of mass destruction, or WMDs. These included chemical weapons, biological weapons, and nuclear weapons. Throughout his rule, Saddam used these weapons against his enemies, using chemical and biological weapons against Iran in the Iran-Iraq War, and he even used chemical weapons such as mustard gas as well as nerve agents against the Kurds, who were, again, his own people. According to Human Rights Watch, this genocide killed between 50,000 and 100,000 Kurds. During this time, Saddam was one of America's best friends. Okay, well that's an oversimplification, but during the 1980s, Saddam definitely wasn't someone the US felt it needed to topple. In fact, he could actually prove useful. The United States backed Saddam in his war with Iran. We now know that the Reagan administration provided Iraq with classified intelligence, technology, and American-made weapons to fight Iran in a war that the US was openly stating that it was, quote, neutral in. Additionally, declassified CIA documents later revealed that the government knew about Saddam's chemical attacks on Iran, but didn't feel the need to report it to the broader international community? Even though Iran was at the time publicly saying that they were being gassed by Iraq and was making a case to the United Nations. But they didn't have any direct evidence that Iraq actually used WMDs on them, because that evidence was secretly in the hands of the United States, who didn't make it public. Why? Because America hates Iran, who is their biggest enemy in the Middle East. And hey look, Iraq was fighting Iran. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, after all. So yeah, America was a bit chummy with Saddam's Iraq, but this was purely for strategic purposes, not necessarily shared values. But then in the 90s, something big happened. Saddam made a huge mistake. He crossed America. In 1990, Iraq invaded its small but wealthy neighbor Kuwait to seize their oil fields and cancel the debt that they held from the Iran-Iraq War. Within 2 days, the Iraqi army, which was the 4th largest in the world at the time, occupied the entire country. This conflict was known as the Persian Gulf War. Kuwait is a petrostate that controlled about 7% of the world's oil reserves. It provided the US and other Western nations with copious amounts of black gold. When Saddam invaded, oil prices spiked overnight. Not only did this threaten America's geopolitical power in the region, Saddam's invasion contributed to a recession in the early 90s. Never mess with America's money. In response, the United Nations allowed a US-led coalition of over 30 countries to liberate Kuwait. They launched an air and ground offensive, and they pummeled, absolutely destroyed, the Iraqi army. The entire offensive was won in just a couple of weeks, and the coalition ground forces pushed Iraq out in 100 hours. Kuwait was liberated. So if you haven't figured it out already, Saddam is a pretty bad guy, and he's the worst kind of bad guy. A bad guy who isn't on our side. As a result, many people in power thought it would be a good idea for America to try to depose him, and this could actually happen now that US troops were right along the Iraqi border. So then US President George H.W. Bush was faced with an important decision. Should he stay put, focus on liberating Kuwait, but keep in place a brutal dictator who killed his own people? Or should he advance his troops into Iraq and go after Saddam? This would violate the UN mandate, but it would give the US the opportunity to get rid of a serial human rights violator. President Bush ultimately decided to stay put, not trying to topple Saddam and replace his regime. After this, a couple of crucial things happened. Iraq would have to pay reparations to Kuwait and return to seized property. There was a review of sanctions, and, most importantly, the United Nations would be allowed to deploy weapons inspectors into Iraq and begin disarming the country of its WMDs. But once again, Saddam would be left in power. National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft and President H.W. Bush argued that going after Saddam would exceed the mandate given by the UN, and it would fracture the coalition that was made to stop him. It also would have gotten the US bogged down in a long, grueling occupation with no guarantee that it would capture Saddam. However, some disagreed with this decision, like this guy, Paul Wolfowitz. Wolfowitz is what is known as a neoconservative, or neocon. Neoconservatism arose in the 1960s in response to the New Left and their staunch opposition to the war in Vietnam. Neoconservatives believe in all the typical conservative domestic policy stuff like small government, deregulation, capitalism, religious conservatism, etc. But they're mostly distinguished by their foreign policy beliefs. Neoconservatives believe that the role of the United States is to protect its status as the world's sole superpower, and it should do this by intervening and even invading other nations in order to spread democracy and capitalism, and to protect its own interests. Peace through strength is a primary philosophy of neocons. In order to achieve peace through strength, neocons and their predecessors would often advocate for the complete overthrow of the government of enemy nations. This is known as regime change, and regime change has been done many times before. The most famous example of American-led regime change was after World War II, when we gave most of Germany a democratic government, replacing the fascist dictatorship that was the Third Reich. I think basically everyone agrees that this was a good example of regime change. At least I hope so. However, there are a lot of lesser-known examples of regime change that still affect our foreign policy today. So for example, do you like bananas? Of course you do. They're sweet, they're high in fiber, high in potassium, they're yellow, and they make a great healthy snack. What's not to like? Well, you know who else liked bananas? The United Fruit Company. Well, okay, I don't know if they liked bananas, but they certainly liked profiting off of them. Hey, when are we getting back to Iraq? Hold on, I'm trying to give examples of regime change. What does this have to do with regime change? Just give me a second. The United Fruit Company was an American corporation that by the early 1900s controlled a significant portion of land in the small Central American country of Guatemala, where they would grow bananas to ship them back to the States. This arrangement worked out quite nicely for the United Fruit Company and the United States, but not so much for the dirt-poor Guatemalan workers growing and harvesting the beloved yellow fruit on UFC-owned banana plantations.
The banana must be cut green and ripened artificially. While we think of it as a hearty, everyday food, this is only because so much care is taken to see that it arrives at our tables in good condition.
It was basically a country within a country. The United Fruit Company almost completely controlled the railways, the telegraph lines, the telephone lines. Anything that had to do with the supply chain of bananas, they owned. And the corrupt Guatemalan dictatorship had no problem with this relationship. But then the Guatemalan people rose up, kicked out the dictator, and formed a democracy. That kept going on for a few years, and then in 1951, the Guatemalans elected Jacobo Arbenz to be their new president. Arbenz had an idea called land reform, which involved taking some of the land owned by the UFC and giving it to the landless peasants. By the way, the government would compensate the company for lost land. But United Fruit was angry about this and didn't believe that they had been compensated fairly enough, and also just meant that they couldn't exploit their workers as much. So they had the interesting idea of going to the United States government and telling President Dwight David Eisenhower, "Hey Dwight, this new Guatemalan president is taking the land from the rich and giving it to the poor." But that can't be. That sounds like communism. That's because it is. Are you gonna let them spread this leftist cultural Marxism all across America? No. And so, in 1954, the CIA carried out an operation that overthrew the entire government. The Guatemalan leaders surrendered, and the U.S. effectively installed Carlos Castillo Armas to be the new country's president. Did I say president? Sorry, I meant dictator. He was a dictator. And Guatemala went from a democracy to a US-backed dictatorship, and it remained that way well into the 90s. You see, when the US says they support freedom, they don't mean democracy, they just mean capitalism. This new pro-capitalist, pro-American regime served the US and the United Fruit Company quite nicely, leading to massive profits as well as the deaths and imprisonment of tens of thousands of Guatemalans for political dissent. Also, hundreds of thousands died in the ensuing civil war. Oops. Our bad. But that's just one example of how regime change went badly. In the early 1950s, the democratically elected leader of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh, was causing trouble because he nationalized the nation's oil supply. This threatened American and especially British interests. So, in 1953, the CIA backed a coup that led to the overthrow of Mossadegh and the installation of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, aka the Shah. The Shah was secular, pro-capitalism, and most importantly, pro-American. He was also, however, a brutal dictator. His secret police terrorized civilians. He tortured his political opponents. The everyday people of Iran suffered while he was living like Marie Antoinette. You know, the whole shebang. Now, I know what you're thinking. That doesn't sound very freedom and democracy and rule of law. And it wasn't. But the US and UK didn't care. The oil must flow. And it did. Until in 1979, when the people of Iran overthrew the Shah and replaced him with a religious cleric who established an Islamic theocracy, which led to Iranians storming the US embassy and holding American embassy staff hostage. Iran is now one of America's biggest enemies, ultimately leading to a more dangerous and hostile geopolitical climate. Oops. Our bad. It was our initial intervention that caused Iran to become our biggest enemy. It's why we felt the need to back Saddam in the 80s in his war against Iran, and why we back countries like Saudi Arabia today. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, after all. So every time you hear a politician talk about how dangerous Iran is and that's why we need to pass another $5 trillion military budget, just know that we're the cause of that. And those are just two examples of regime change. There are numerous others. The US has done this so many times that there's an entire, lengthy, and I mean lengthy, Wikipedia page detailing US involvement in regime change, including This leads us back to our friend Paul Wolfowitz. In the 90s, Wolfowitz served as Undersecretary of Defense. He strongly opposed the decision to leave Iraq alone. In 1998, he, along with 17 other neocons, wrote a letter to President Clinton saying that the US should, quote, aim at the removal of Saddam Hussein's regime from power. And he got his wish because that same year, Congress passed the Iraq Liberation Act, which made regime change the stated policy of the US government regarding Iraq. Wolfowitz was set on his goal. He longed for regime change in Iraq. All he needed to put his plan into action was power. And the man that would give him that power was George W. Bush, the 43rd President of the United States. Why do I emphasize the W? Well, to distinguish him from his dad, George H.W. Bush, who served as the 41st President, the one from earlier. George W. Bush served as the popular governor of Texas in the late 90s. He also worked in the oil business, which is a piece of information that may or may not be relevant later. Bush always lived in his father's shadow, and he desperately wanted to escape it. In the late 90s, Bush decided to run for president. Hey, if his dad could do it, why not him?
But whatever you do, don't equate my integrity and trustworthiness to Bill Clinton. That's about as low a blow as you can give in the Republican primary. And that's what...
And he ended up winning the Republican nomination. The Democrats chose Al Gore, who was the current vice president under one William Jefferson Clinton. During the presidential debates, the two men were asked about foreign policy and what the role of America should be. Should America focus on itself, or should it be involved in the affairs of countries around the world? Bush came out in strong support of the former.
But we can't be all things to all people in the world, Jim. And I think that's where maybe the vice president and I begin to have some differences. I am worried about overcommitting our military around the world. I want to be judicious in its use. So I don't think our troops ought to be used for what's called nation building. You mentioned Haiti. I wouldn't have sent troops to Haiti. I didn't think it was a mission worthwhile. It was a nation building mission. And it was not very successful. It cost us billions, a couple of billions of dollars, and I'm not so sure democracy's any better off in Haiti than it was before.
Are we going to step up to the plate as a nation, the way we did after World War II? The generation of heroes said, okay, the United States is going to be the leader. And the world benefited tremendously from the courage that they showed in those post-war years.
I'm not so sure the role of the United States is to go around the world and say this is the way it's got to be.
What a strong argument. Let's see if that worldview sticks. The election was held on November 7th, 2000, and America voted on who its next president would be. And the winner is... What? No one? Alright, so the election was close. Very, very close. Like, it came down to just one state. Florida, because of course it was Florida. Here's what happened. The news networks originally called Florida for Al Gore.
CNN announces that we call Florida in the Al Gore column. This is a state both campaigns desperately wanted to win.
But as more and more votes came in from the heavily Republican Floridian panhandle, the networks retracted their call. Some even called it for Bush.
CNN right now is moving our earlier declaration of Florida back to the too close to call column.
Bush was leading Gore by 100,000 votes, which would give him the presidency. Al Gore called George Bush to concede the election.
Holding back. Michael, got to interrupt you. We are now calling, Fox News now projects George W. Bush the winner in Florida, and thus it appears the winner of the presidency of the United States.
But as more and more Gore votes had come in from the heavily Democratic counties, Gore called Bush again to retract his concession.
An official call, it's just too confusing. Florida's been in play all night long. All right, we're officially saying that Florida is too close to call because of a recall. Campaign and voter counters are being called back to work to count absentee ballots. Will that be going on throughout the evening, so far as we know? Yes, it will be happening even as we speak. They're being called back tonight, so we take Florida away from George W. Bush.
Bush's lead in Florida had shrunk to just about 900 votes. By the morning of November 8th, there was still no clear winner. Gore demanded a hand recount in 4 counties. However, the Republican Florida Secretary of State said,
"You have until November 14th to complete the recount. If you don't complete by then, too bad. I'm certifying the election anyways."
Hey, you can't do that.
Yes, I can.
The Gore campaign petitioned the Florida Supreme Court to extend the deadline, which it did. But the biggest county in Florida, Miami-Dade, was like, there's like so many ballots I have to recount, and I'm tired, so I'm just not gonna do it. Hey, you can't do that. Make them do that. No. On November 26th, Florida certified their ballots, and Bush had a lead of just 537 votes. Gore, on the other hand, had won the popular vote. But hey, this is America. The president isn't chosen by the people. So George Bush would be set to be the next president of the United States. I'm suing. The Florida Supreme Court allowed the recount to finish, but Bush quickly appealed all the way to the Supreme Court. This was a big deal. For the first time in American history, the Supreme Court would decide a presidential election. The court had to deal with 2 constitutional questions. 1. Did the Florida Supreme Court violate Article 2, Section 1, Clause 2 of the U.S. Constitution when they intervened in the state's election laws? And 2. Did the arbitrary, standardless, manual recounts violate the equal protection and due process clauses of the Constitution? The court said yes and sided with Bush, but in 2 different ways. It ruled 7-2 that because different counties used different methods and different standards in doing their recounts, they had violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. But the more controversial decision, the one that really killed Gore's chances of winning, was a 5-4 decision on what the solution to this problem may be. The court ruled, since there's not enough time to come up with a fair way to do a recount, I say that we don't even try and just give the election to Bush. Case dismissed. Yes. What? And so, on January 20th, 2001, despite losing the popular vote, and technically we don't even know if he ever actually won Florida, George Walker Bush, with the help of his dad's Supreme Court picks, was sworn in as the 43rd President of the United States. Now, I know what you're thinking. What? But that's so stupid! Don't worry, I'm sure that no monumental events that will completely change the face of American politics and society forever and make it really, really matter who the president is won't happen within the next 4 to 8 years.
We understand that there has been a plane crash on the southern tip of Manhattan. You're looking at the World Trade Center. We understand that a plane has crashed into the World Trade Center. We don't know anything more than that. We don't know if it was a commercial aircraft. We don't know if it was a private aircraft.
9/11 changed everything. It changed the way we travel through airports. It changed our culture and our fears and our stigmas. And the government wasted no time in responding to such attacks. Congress created the Department of Homeland Security, which would work to prevent future terror attacks and increase public safety. It created the TSA, a beloved administration adored by travelers the world over. It changed our culture and our social climate. There was a rise in Islamophobia and a rise in hate crimes against Muslims. But most importantly, it changed America's foreign policy. Communism wasn't public enemy number one anymore. Now it was terrorism. Saudi-born militant Osama bin Laden, the leader of the Islamic terrorist group Al-Qaeda, orchestrated the largest attack on American civilians on U.S. soil in history. Nearly 3,000 people were tragically killed. Bin Laden carried out the attacks to convince the U.S. to withdraw troops from the Muslim world. Let's just say that didn't happen. Quite the opposite, actually. Our buddy Paul Wolfowitz is now the Deputy Secretary of Defense. That basically means he's the #2 guy in the Defense Department. Once it was found out that Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda were behind 9/11, the entire national security apparatus of the nation was in full swing, thinking of a way to respond. Bush declared a, quote, war on terror. A global war on terror, and it was kind of like a new Cold War in the sense that it was a bunch of wars done all in the purpose of pursuing one stated goal. For the Cold War, it was defeating communism, and for the war on terror, it was for defeating, well, terrorism. In the days following 9/11, the first front for this global war on terror was brought in: Afghanistan. Afghanistan was ruled by the Taliban, a group of militant Islamic fundamentalists. It was believed that Osama bin Laden and many other al-Qaeda leaders were hiding in Afghanistan, and the Taliban was accused of harboring bin Laden and providing a safe haven for terrorists. So the discussion from the international community was on Afghanistan, but Paul Wolfowitz was focused on Iraq, a country that had nothing to do with 9/11, and the intelligence community knew this at the time. Yet, he was still urging America to attack the country. Like, it was actually really annoying. Everyone else was focused on Afghanistan, and all he wanted to talk about was Iraq. We have to come up with an invasion plan. But guys, what about Iraq? We have an invasion plan. Okay, but have you thought about Iraq? We're trying everything we can to negotiate with the Taliban. Okay, but what about Iraq? Mr. President, here's that McMuffin you ordered. Read my plan to invade Iraq. Ah! Mr. President, we're preparing our troops for the Afghan invasion. Hey, maybe we should talk about Iraq. Will you shut up about Iraq? On September 15th, Bush convened his National Security Council at Camp David. The topic of discussion was the response to international terrorism. And now it's time to meet the squad. Not that squad. First up, Vice President Dick Cheney. He served as the White House Chief of Staff during the Nixon and Ford administrations, and was then the sole representative of the state of Wyoming in Congress. He then served as the Secretary of Defense under Bush's dad, which means he was in charge of handling the previously mentioned Gulf War. After that, Cheney had a stint in the private sector as the CEO of Halliburton, a multinational corporation that has large holdings in the oil industry. Remember that, by the way, it might come up later. On foreign policy, while he didn't personally identify as a neocon, he did associate himself with neocons. Interestingly though, back in the 90s, when Bush's dad was making the crucial decision to not go after Saddam, Cheney agreed with the president, saying that it was not worth additional American lives and would mean that the US would, quote, get bogged down in the problems of trying to take over and govern Iraq.
Do you think that the US or UN forces should have moved into Baghdad?
No.
Why not?
Because if we'd gone to Baghdad, we would have been all alone. There wouldn't have been anybody else with us. It would have been a U.S. occupation of Iraq. None of the Arab forces that were willing to fight with us in Kuwait were willing to invade Iraq. Once you got to Iraq and took it over and took down Saddam Hussein's government, then what are you going to put in its place? That's a very volatile part of the world, and if you take down the central government in Iraq, you can easily end up seeing pieces of Iraq fly off. It's a quagmire if you go that far and try to take over Iraq. The other thing was casualties. Everyone was impressed with the fact that we were able to do our job with as few casualties as we had. But for the 146 Americans killed in action and for their families, it wasn't a cheap war. And the question for the president, in terms of whether or not we went on to Baghdad and took additional casualties in an effort to get Saddam Hussein, was how many additional dead Americans is Saddam worth? And our judgment was not very many, and I think we got it right.
Let's see if this mindset sticks. Also, one more thing about Dick Cheney. His daughter is gay. Not Liz, the other one, which, if you're a Republican, is kind of a liability today, but in 2000 it was a big no-no. Cheney had to toe the line between not angering his horrible homophobic conservative base and not alienating his own daughter. So Cheney didn't really talk about gay marriage that much, just saying that it was a states' rights issue, the ultimate cop-out of conservatives everywhere. Not really important to the immediate story, just interesting to note. Now on to Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld. This guy was basically Dick Cheney's mentor during the Nixon years. Rumsfeld had served as the Secretary of Defense under Gerald Ford in the 70s, and now again under Bush. So he served as both the youngest ever Secretary of Defense and the oldest ever Secretary of Defense. He's also Wolfowitz's boss and an extreme war hawk. He's never met a war he didn't like. George Packer of The Atlantic called him, quote, the worst Secretary of Defense in American history. And even Henry Kissinger called him, quote, the most ruthless man. Henry Kissinger. Rest in piss. Then we have Colin Powell, and yes, it's pronounced Colin, not Colin, the first black Secretary of State. Colin Powell wasn't as hawkish as the rest of Bush's cabinet, meaning he wasn't as pro-war, and he and Rumsfeld would spend a lot of their time fighting over what to do after 9/11. But they never fought in front of the president. In front of the president, they got along real nicely, but everyone else in those meetings knew the truth about their relationship. Finally, there's Condoleezza Rice, or Condi. She was the then National Security Advisor, but in the months following 9/11, she was Bush's main advisor, meeting with the president practically every day. She was the only woman on Bush's National Security Council, but that support did not garner respect from her peers. Condi was talented, she was a competitive ice skater, she played piano at concerts, and she had extensive knowledge of foreign policy. But Rumsfeld wasn't impressed by any of this. According to future CIA Director Bill Burns, during meetings, he would ignore her, quote, to the point of absolute rudeness. And so, her influence was drowned out by Rumsfeld and Powell's constant face-to-face bickering. She was relegated to acting like a mediator between the two. Notice, the following scene actually happened, with statements from officials either being directly quoted or paraphrased for dramatic effect. If it's a global war on terror, you need to show it's global. Rumsfeld then raised the possibility of military action against Iraq, but Powell cautioned against the proposal. There are a bunch of countries that are ready to be our allies against the perpetrators of 9/11. These alliances will collapse if we invade some unrelated country. Well, then maybe it's not a coalition worth having. Then, Wolfowitz spoke up. You know, it's pretty unreasonable to assume that Al-Qaeda orchestrated these attacks all by themselves. They must have had some kind of outside help from, I don't know, Iraq? Saddam Hussein is the head of the snake of the network of global terrorism. What? May I remind you, ladies and gentlemen, that when even some of our biggest adversaries like Iran and Libya gave their sympathy to our country after these attacks, Saddam said that this country, quote, reaps the thorns that its leaders have planted in the world. Don't you think it's a little suspicious that only he gives such a cold, unsympathetic response? Bombing Afghanistan would be pounding sand. The exercise would be futile. Iraq, on the other hand, has a plethora of promising targets, and it's an opportunity to show the rest of the world that we mean business. What? Wolfowitz, what the hell are you talking about? Cover Black, the director of the CIA's Counterintelligence Center, was astonished by Wolfowitz's suggestions. It contradicted everything that Black knew about Islamic extremism. He was even more alarmed that none of his superiors didn't immediately shut Wolfowitz down. So he stepped up and raised his hand. Yes, Kofer? Mr. President, We were attacked on September 11th by Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. Saddam Hussein in Iraq have nothing whatsoever to do with this. Wolfowitz responded, and the two quickly jockeyed each other on the supposed connections between Iraq and Osama bin Laden. Bush was like, "All right, guys, let's move away from Iraq for now." The meeting eventually concluded, and many of the attendees assured themselves that the president would not take Wolfowitz's assertions seriously. Bush even told his chief of staff to tell Wolfowitz to pipe down about Iraq. And so the idea of invading Iraq died right there, and we never went to war. Oh, wait, nope, never mind. That afternoon, the president snuggled up by a fireplace drinking coffee. Other principal officers of his administration were in the background, playing piano and singing along. Dick Cheney, Scooter Libby, and Paul Wolfowitz sat with Bush, all of them likely wondering about how our nation should respond post these events. Then, Wolfowitz told the president, "You know, Mr. President, to be frank, I'm not that impressed by this Afghanistan response. Blowing up a few tents in the desert isn't going to do much." "Well," Bush replied, "no one had a plan that was more impressive." Wolfowitz seized his moment. "Well, actually, I do. Come with me." You see, this half of Iraq's population is basically controlled by the Kurds, who hate Saddam, so they'll welcome us with open arms. The other half is right up by the Kuwaiti border, so all we have to do is swoop in, liberate this part of Iraq, and take all the oil fields. Wait, did you say oil fields? Yup, and because of how reliant Iraq is on oil for its economy, Saddam's influence would be sufficiently quelled. He would be isolated, making him nothing more than the mayor of Baghdad. Wow, just like that, and all we have to do is take the oil... Oh, crap. You know, I don't know why you insist on drinking from those. They aren't very good mugs. They don't fit in a cup holder, and they easily spill when you tip them over. Well, I like them for their indestructibility. I saw a video on TikTok once of it surviving a car fire. This material is crazy. We should make our tanks out of it. When are you gonna be in a car fire? I'm the president. It could be part of an assassination attempt on my motorcade. It could happen. Remember when that reporter tried to kill me with his shoes? That event hasn't happened yet. Well, whatever. Women across America drink from this cup, and so I must too. I'm a man of the people, after all. Fair enough. Now, can you please get back to what you were saying about oil? Yes. Once we control the oil, we control everything. Saddam will be toppled, just like that. Remember when I said that Bush used to work in the Texas oil industry? Well, it's pretty clear that Wolfowitz knew that, and he used that magic three-letter word as a point of intrigue to his plan. And intrigued the president was. He responded to Wolfowitz, "Why didn't you bring this up in the meeting?" Wolfowitz responded, "Well, it's not my place to contradict my superiors." That day, the spark for war had been lit.